I let my dad and his new wife move into my house because he was struggling financially. I thought I was doing the right thing, offering him a safe space after his mistakes. But just a month later, his wife sat me down to demand that I pay them rent. My life didn't start off easy. My mom passed away while giving birth to me. It was a cruel twist of fate, and I spent my childhood bearing the blame for something that was never my fault. My dad, Matthew, couldn't cope with her death. Instead of dealing with his grief, he took it out on me, his son, Ethan. Throughout my childhood, there was never a day when Matthew didn't remind me in some way that I was the reason my mom was gone. He said my birth had taken away the woman he loved most, and he'd never wanted me in the first place. I heard things like, "You took your mother's life, so you'd better make yours count," or "Don't let her sacrifice be for nothing." When you're a kid, you don't understand the weight of grief, loss, and misplaced anger. All I knew was that I was unwanted. I didn't just lack a loving father. I had a parent who seemed to resent my very existence. The guilt of simply being alive was heavy, suffocating. I longed to talk to him, to explain how much his words hurt, but I was too afraid. On the rare occasions I tried, he shut me down with more bitterness and blame. So I stopped trying. While other kids had parents who supported them, who cheered for them at games, who tucked them into bed with love, I walked on eggshells. One wrong word or one misstep, and I'd be met with his simmering anger. He made me feel like my existence was a burden he was forced to bear. I wanted to believe he'd change. Every report card with good grades was an opportunity to make him proud. I'd approach him, hoping for just one smile, one kind word. But he barely glanced at the grades and told me to work harder. "There are hundreds of other kids who get better grades," he'd say. No matter what I did, I was never enough. It wasn't just academics. Anything outside of school was off limits. Sports, clubs, or hanging out with friends were all distractions to him. He believed I had no right to enjoy life. He made it clear that my only purpose was to study and leave his house as soon as I could. The rejection and isolation wore me down. Birthdays were the hardest. Most kids loved celebrating, but for me, my birthday was a reminder of the day my mom died. When I turned 15, I wanted to go out for pizza and a movie with friends, but when I asked Matthew for money, he exploded. "You have no right to celebrate the day your mother died," he screamed. That was the last time I asked. I buried my hopes and dreams. I stopped expecting love or approval from him because it only led to disappointment. I focused on one goal: escaping. I poured everything into my studies, and finally, it paid off. I remember the moment I opened my acceptance letter to a top university, a full scholarship in hand. Relief flooded me. I was free. I packed my bags, ready to start a new life. Far from the suffocating walls of Matthew's home. College was a revelation. For the first time, I lived on my own terms. I made friends, joined clubs, and pursued interests I'd long suppressed. Matthew tried to control me from a distance, but I no longer listened. I was finally living. During this time, I met Sheila. She was smart, driven, and we clicked instantly. Sheila understood me in a way no one else ever had. With her, I didn't have to pretend or carry the weight of guilt I'd been dragging around. She encouraged me to go to therapy, something I'd never considered before. Her support helped me break free from the toxic beliefs I'd grown up with. Therapy was hard. I had to confront painful truths, but it was also freeing. I learned that Matthew's anger was his burden, not mine. For the first time, I started to let go of the guilt. But with that freedom came anger. Years of resentment I'd bottled up finally surfaced. I snapped at Matthew during our rare phone calls, his attempts to control me now falling on deaf ears. One night, in a moment of pent-up frustration, I confronted him. I told him how his blame and bitterness had poisoned my childhood. I made it clear I was done being his scapegoat. For once, he had nothing to say. He didn't apologize, but he didn't deny it either. A small part of me hoped for change, but the damage was deep. Our relationship remained strained. Even as I tried to move on, Matthew lingered in the background, a shadow of old wounds. When he married his girlfriend Denise, I went to the wedding out of duty, not joy. I hoped marriage would soften him. But hope has a way of turning on you. Just a month after the wedding, he called. desperate. He was facing eviction after months of unpaid rent. He asked me to cover it. I refused. I'd worked hard to build my life, and I wasn't his financial safety net. But guilt gnawed at me. After talking with Sheila, I relented. I offered him and Denise a temporary place in my house until they could get back on their feet. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance to mend fences, but old habits die hard. When my dad and Denise moved in, I thought maybe, just maybe, things would be different. I wasn't the scared, quiet kid he'd raised. I was an adult now. This was my house, and I had my own rules, my own way of living. I laid it all out clearly from the start. This arrangement was temporary. They were here to get back on their feet, and I expected them to help out around the house. No special treatment, no free ride. I thought being direct would avoid misunderstandings. But I should have known better. The first month wasn't too bad. We were all adjusting to this new situation, trying to figure out our routines. I kept reminding myself that I was doing this to help my dad, that this was an act of kindness. But as the days went by, the little cracks started to show. It started with small things that shouldn't have bothered me as much as they did. Dishes left in the sink, laundry piling up, lights left on in empty rooms. I'd come home after a long day of work to find the house in chaos. My dad and Denise would be sitting in the living room watching TV, as if they didn't have a care in the world. I tried to brush it off. After all, it wasn't worth starting a fight over something so minor. But it wasn't just the mess, it was the attitude behind it. My dad acted like he was doing me a favor by staying in my house. He had this sense of entitlement, like he still had some authority over me, like I was still that kid who owed him everything. One evening, I got home exhausted, the weight of the day pressing down on me. The house was a wreck, dishes in the sink, empty soda cans on the coffee table, crumbs scattered across the floor. My jaw clenched. I'd told them over and over to pick up after themselves. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my frustration in check. "Dad," I said, keeping my voice steady, "it's your turn to do the dishes. I need you to help out around here." He didn't even look away from the TV. "You're a grown man, Ethan. I raised you by myself after your mom died. You should be ashamed for asking me to do chores." That was the trigger. All the old anger, the resentment, the years of being blamed for something I couldn't control, it all bubbled to the surface. "You know what's actually embarrassing, Dad?" I snapped. "You're sitting on my couch, in my house, eating my food, and you have the nerve to order me around? You begged me to let you move in, and now you can't even do the bare minimum. If you don't want to help out, then maybe you should find somewhere else to stay." He stared at me, stunned. For a moment, I thought he might get up and leave right then and there, but he didn't. He just sat there, silent, his face hard and unreadable. I turned and walked into the kitchen, my hands shaking with frustration. The next morning, I was in the kitchen making coffee when Denise walked in. She looked serious, her eyes narrowed. "Ethan, can we talk?" I nodded, feeling a knot form in my stomach. I already knew this wasn't going to go well. She sat down at the table and folded her hands in front of her. "You really hurt your dad last night," she said quietly. "After everything he's done for you, the sacrifices he's made, you should show him more respect." I couldn't help it. I laughed, a bitter, hollow laugh. "Sacrifices? Denise, he didn't sacrifice anything for me. He spent my whole childhood blaming me for my mom's death. He never helped me, never supported me. He didn't even give me a dime when I bought this house." Her brows furrowed. "What are you talking about? Your dad told me he used his savings to help you buy this place." My laughter died in my throat. I stared at her, the pieces clicking into place. Of course, he'd lied to her, made up some story to keep his pride intact. "Denise," I said slowly, "my dad didn't help me buy this house. I worked hard, saved every penny, and bought it on my own. He didn't contribute a single cent." Her face went pale. "Wait, are you serious?" "Dead serious," I said. "Your husband has been lying to you." She looked away, her hands trembling slightly. I could see the embarrassment and anger building up in her eyes. I didn't know," I shrugged. "It's not your fault. He's always been like this." She didn't argue. Instead, she stood up, her face tight with emotion. "I need some time to think," she muttered before walking out of the kitchen. That same afternoon, she packed her bags and left. I didn't stop her. It wasn't my place to. She deserved the truth, even if it hurt. The house felt eerily quiet after Denise left, the kind of silence that weighed heavy, like something was about to break. I knew it wasn't over. My dad, Matthew, was still here, and that silence wouldn't last long. He came home that evening, his footsteps dragging across the floor. When he saw Denise's things gone, his eyes narrowed. The tension in his jaw was almost visible, like a storm brewing behind his eyes. He didn't say anything to me right away, but I could feel it coming. The accusation, the blame, the anger he always carried just below the surface. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, trying to act like I didn't care. But my heart was pounding. Finally, he turned to me, his voice low and sharp. "Where's Denise?" he asked, though I knew he already had the answer. "She left," I replied flatly, after I told her the truth. His face twisted, a mix of rage and disbelief. "You couldn't keep your mouth shut, could you?" he snapped. "You just had to ruin things for me. You embarrassed me, made her think I'm some kind of liar." I looked at him, my jaw tight. "I didn't make her think anything. You did that yourself when you lied to her. She deserved to know the truth." He ran his hands through his hair, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. "You always think you're better than me, Ethan. Just because you have this house, this life, you think you can look down on me." I shook my head, the frustration bubbling up again. "This isn't about me thinking I'm better, Dad. This is about you refusing to take responsibility. You messed up, and instead of owning it, you let your pride turn you into a liar." He stopped pacing, his eyes boring into me. "You think you're so righteous, huh? You think everything you have is because you're some kind of hero?" His voice rose, shaking with bitterness. "I worked my ass off raising you. I sacrificed everything for you." I felt that familiar pang of anger and disbelief. "You didn't sacrifice for me," I shot back. "You sacrificed me. You made me pay for Mom's death every day of my life. You didn't raise me out of love. You tolerated me because you had no choice." His face flushed red, but this time there was no immediate comeback. Just silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. For the first time, I saw something shift in his eyes. Not remorse, not understanding, just emptiness. "I didn't ask for your help, Ethan," he finally muttered, his voice cold. "I don't need your pity." I exhaled sharply, the weight of his words cutting deep. "Then maybe it's time for you to go. If you don't want my help, if all you can do is blame me, then there's no point in staying here." He stared at me, his lips pressed into a thin line. For a second, I thought he might argue, might fight to stay. But then his shoulders slumped, and he looked away. He knew he'd pushed too far this time. The next morning, he packed up his things. It wasn't much. A few bags of clothes, some personal items, the remnants of a life he'd never managed to rebuild. I watched him from the doorway, my heart a mess of emotions. Anger, sadness, relief, guilt. Even after everything, watching him leave felt like ripping out a part of myself. As he walked past me, he paused. His eyes met mine, and for a moment I thought he might say something. An apology maybe, or at least a goodbye. But all he did was shake his head, like he was disappointed in me, like I was the one who had let him down. Without another word, he stepped out the door and walked away. The door closed behind him, and the silence that followed was different. It wasn't heavy or suffocating anymore. It was still, like the air finally settled after a storm. I stood there for a moment, letting it wash over me. He was gone. The man who had cast his shadow over my entire life was finally out of my house. Out of my life. Maybe not forever, but at least for now. I should have felt free, relieved. But all I felt was exhaustion, like I'd just finished a battle I never signed up for. I sank onto the couch, my head in my hands. The memories of the past few days, the arguments, the accusations, the bitterness, replayed over and over. I had done what I needed to do, what was right for my own sanity, but it didn't feel like a victory. Sheila found me like that an hour later, still sitting there, lost in thought. She didn't say anything at first. She just sat next to me, her hand slipping into mine. Her warmth, her presence, was a reminder that I wasn't alone. "Are you okay?" she finally whispered. I took a shaky breath. "I don't know, I feel empty." She squeezed my hand gently. "You did the right thing, Ethan. You stood up for yourself. You protected your peace." "I know," I said softly, "but it still hurts." "That's because you care," she said. "Even after everything, he's still your dad. But caring doesn't mean you have to let him hurt you." I nodded, tears welling in my eyes. For the first time in years, I let them fall. Sheila didn't say anything more. She just held me as I let out years of pent-up pain. The tears were quiet, but they carried the weight of so much: grief, anger, loss. It was like finally letting go of a poison that had been in my veins for too long. When the tears stopped, the emptiness was still there, but it felt lighter somehow. Like maybe, just maybe, there was room now for something new. Something better. The days after my dad left felt strange, like I was living in a different world. The house, once filled with tension and resentment, felt lighter. It was the same place, with the same walls, same rooms, but the air had shifted. It felt mine again, truly mine. And yet, there was a hollow space where all the anger used to be. I tried to slip back into my routine: work, home, a quiet dinner with Sheila, but something had changed inside me. I had spent years battling with shadows, old wounds that never quite healed. Now that my dad was gone, I expected to feel free. Instead, I just felt unsettled. Like I was standing on new ground, unsure of how to walk forward. One evening, I sat on the back porch, watching the sun dip behind the trees. The sky was a swirl of pink and orange, soft hues that whispered of peace. Sheila came out and joined me, 2 mugs of tea in her hands. She handed me one and sat beside me, her shoulder touching mine. We didn't say anything for a while. The silence was comfortable, the kind you only share with someone who understands you. "You seem far away," she finally said. I took a sip of the tea, feeling the warmth spread through me. "I guess I'm just trying to figure out what comes next." For so long, everything was about surviving him, dealing with his anger, his blame. Now that he's gone, I don't know what to focus on. She nodded, her eyes soft and knowing. "It's like a storm has passed, but you're still standing there, bracing yourself for the wind." "Yeah," I whispered, "exactly like that." Sheila placed her hand on mine. "Maybe it's time to rebuild, Ethan. Not just the house, not just routines. Maybe it's time to rebuild you." Her words settled deep in my chest. Rebuilding myself. The idea felt both terrifying and liberating. Who was I when I wasn't trying to prove myself to my dad? Who was I when I wasn't carrying his blame? I looked at Sheila, her eyes full of patience and love. "How do I even start?" "Step by step," she said. "Let go of the things that don't serve you anymore. The guilt, the anger, the need to please him. And fill those spaces with things that bring you joy, peace, and purpose." I thought about that for a long moment. Maybe it was time to give myself permission to be happy, to pursue the life I wanted without guilt or shame. My dad's anger didn't have to shape me anymore. His words didn't have to define my worth. The next few weeks were quiet, a time of slow healing. I started small, cleaning the house, reclaiming spaces that felt tainted by my dad's presence. I rearranged the furniture, added new plants, and opened the windows to let fresh air in. It was like I was wiping away the residue of the past, making room for something new. I spent more time with Sheila, doing things that made me feel alive. We went on long walks in the woods where the scent of pine and earth grounded me. We laughed over silly movies, cooked dinners together, and sat in comfortable silence. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't just surviving, I was living. But healing wasn't a straight path. Some nights, the old memories came back. His harsh words, the look of disappointment in his eyes, the way he made me feel like a burden. Those memories still hurt, but they didn't have the same power over me. They were just echoes now, reminders of a past I was learning to leave behind. One evening, Sheila and I were sitting by the fire pit in the backyard, the flames dancing in the cool night air. I stared into the fire, the flickering light reminding me of all the battles I'd fought within myself. "I think I'm ready to let go," I said softly. Sheila turned to me, her eyes reflecting the warmth of the fire. "Let go of what?" "The need for his approval," I replied. "The guilt, the resentment. I've been carrying those things for so long, but they're not mine to carry anymore." She smiled, a soft, encouraging smile. "That's a big step, Ethan. I'm proud of you." Her words settled over me like a blanket, comforting and warm. I realized then that the approval I had spent my life chasing wasn't something my dad could give me. It was something I had to give myself. A week later, I found myself thinking about Denise. She had been caught in the middle of something she didn't fully understand. She had believed my dad's lies because that's all she knew. I wondered how she was doing, if she'd managed to piece things together after everything fell apart. I decided to reach out. I found her number and sent a simple message. "Hey, Denise. I hope you're okay. If you ever want to talk, I'm here." I didn't expect a reply, but a few hours later, my phone buzzed. It was her. "Thank you, Ethan. I'd like to talk. There's a lot I didn't know." We met at a quiet cafe the next afternoon. She looked tired, like she'd been carrying her own burdens. When she saw me, she gave a small smile, a tentative one. We sat down, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, she sighed. "I'm sorry for what happened, Ethan. I didn't know the truth. He told me so many things, and I believed him." I nodded, understanding her pain. He's good at that, making people believe what he wants them to. I spent my whole life trying to live up to his stories, his expectations. She shook her head, her eyes glistening with tears. "I just wish I had known sooner. Maybe things would have been different." "Maybe," I said softly. "But it's not your fault, Denise. You didn't do anything wrong." She wiped her eyes and gave me a grateful look. "Thank you for saying that." We talked for hours, sharing stories and unraveling the mess my dad had created. By the time we left the cafe, something felt lighter. Maybe forgiveness didn't have to come all at once, but understanding was a good place to start. The days rolled into weeks, and the weeks into months. Life settled into a rhythm, one that felt calm and steady. The chaos my dad brought with him had faded, like ripples on water finally smoothing out. I was still standing, still breathing, and that felt like a quiet victory. Sheila stayed by my side, a constant presence that I never took for granted. Her love felt like sunlight filtering through the trees, warm, gentle, always reaching me even when I didn't realize I needed it. Together, we built a life that was ours. A life where peace wasn't just a distant dream, but something I could touch and hold on to. I spent more time reflecting on my journey, the path I'd walked to get here. There were scars, sure, but they didn't ache like they used to. They reminded me of where I came from, of the battles I'd fought, and won. I realized healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning to live with it, to let it shape me without defining me. One weekend, Sheila and I decided to clear out the guest room, the room where my dad had stayed. The door had been closed for weeks, like a chapter I wasn't ready to revisit. But now, I felt different. I was ready to reclaim it, to turn that space into something new. We opened the door together. The air inside felt stale, heavy with memories. My dad's scent, the lingering energy of his presence, still clung to the room. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "Let's start fresh," I said quietly. We stripped the bed, packed away his things, and cleaned every corner. With each sweep of the broom, each wipe of the cloth, it felt like I was sweeping away pieces of the past. The weight on my chest lightened bit by bit. By the time we were done, the room felt different. Empty, but in a good way. Like a canvas waiting for new stories. Sheila smiled at me, her eyes shining with pride. "What do you want to do with it?" I thought for a moment. "A space for creativity, a place where I can write, think, and just be myself." We painted the walls a soft blue, the color of calm skies. I set up a desk by the window, where the morning light poured in. A few plants, some shelves for books, a cozy chair in the corner. It wasn't just a room anymore, it was a sanctuary. My sanctuary. One afternoon, as I was organizing some old papers, my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen and froze. It was a message from my dad. "Ethan, I know I messed up. I'm sorry for everything. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I hope you're doing okay." I stared at the words for a long time. They felt out of place, like they didn't belong to the man I knew. For a moment, anger bubbled up. Too little, too late. But then, something softer settled in. Not forgiveness, not yet, but an understanding that he was human too, broken in his own way. I didn't know if I was ready to respond, so I didn't. Instead, I let the message sit there, like a seed planted in the soil. Maybe one day I'd find the right words. Maybe not. And that was okay. Healing wasn't a straight path. It was a winding trail, one I was still walking. That evening, I sat outside with Sheila, watching the sun sink below the horizon. The sky was painted with soft golds and purples, the kind of beauty that made you feel small and infinite at the same time. A gentle breeze whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of earth and life. "You know," I said softly, "for the first time, I don't feel like I'm running away from anything." Sheila squeezed my hand. "You're not. You're walking forward." I nodded. "Yeah, and it feels good." The past would always be part of me, like rings in the trunk of a tree, each year, each struggle, etched into who I was. But those rings also made me strong. My roots were deep, and now, finally, I had the wings to go wherever I wanted. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living, and that made all the difference. In the quiet of that moment, with Sheila beside me and the world stretching out ahead, I felt a peace I hadn't known before. The weight of my dad's blame, the shadows of my childhood, the guilt I'd carried for so long, they were finally loosening their grip. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing: it was mine to shape. Step by step, I was walking forward, guided by hope, by love, and by the simple truth that I was enough, just as I was. And that was a beginning worth embracing.